Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. This episode, my special guest is Professor Frans van der Donk of Nebraska College of Law. He is one of a kind, folks. He is an expert in space law. And as we approach the 50th anniversary later this summer of the historic landing on the moon by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin of Apollo 11, it is a great time to take a look at what is happening in space, and there is a ton happening in space as more and more countries and more companies like Amazon and Elon Musk's SpaceX are launching not only sort of vanity missions into space for space tourism, which is going to be a fascinating development in years to come, but also vitally important commercial development operations, whether on the moon or on asteroids, looking for precious metals and things like that. This is coming, whether we know it or not. And there has to be law, believe it or not, to deal with this. And that's why Professor van der Donk is so important and so fascinating in this topic. We are speaking to him on this episode from his home in the Netherlands, where he is working now that school is out for the summer. So bear with us. The connection at times is a little rough. It may sound like we're talking to him from outer space, but we're only talking to him across the ocean. But nonetheless, please bear with us, as there might be a few crackles in the line. It's well worth it. A super fascinating conversation, and one I have been really looking forward to, and I know you're going to enjoy as well. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. In just a few weeks, we're going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the historic Apollo 11 landing on the moon. Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong taking the first steps on the moon just 50 years ago. And to explore, if you will, the issue of how the law is going to deal with all the incredible developments in space, with space exploration, not only with efforts in this country, but internationally. I want to welcome my guest, probably the most well-known and widely experienced expert in space law, Professor Frans van der Donk of the Nebraska College of Law. Professor, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
You're welcome. I enjoy doing that.
You have such a fantastic background. I thought we could start, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little background on yourself, and that will lead us into the idea of what is a space lawyer, as you are, and what is space law?
Right. Well, my career started in academia. I worked at the Leiden University, which is a university in the Netherlands, at the College of Law there, in the General International Law Department, and that already tells you that space law, and you briefly indicated that already, is essentially a part of international law. Having said that, at the university, increasingly we also got involved in more consultancy-like advisory jobs for the government and for the European Commission at the time in particular. So at a certain point in time, I decided to more clearly split the two and continue my academic work at that time still at Leiden University, which basically means teaching and researching space law, and separating that from my more commercial consultancy work, which I then started doing for my own firm. And then within a short period of time, the University of Nebraska came along and did me an offer I couldn't refuse, so I didn't. And since 11 years, I've been doing all my academic work now overseas, from my perspective, in the U.S., while my company is still run from my home here in the Netherlands.
And you're calling us from the Netherlands, and I appreciate that very much. So you're done with the academic term, and I guess you've gone home to the Netherlands for the summer. Is that right?
Yes, and in addition, also for work for my company, for example, 2 weeks from now, I'm having another job with the European Commission in Brussels, who is, of course, trying to promote the European position in many fields of space, including, or I should rather say, focusing very much on the on the pragmatic and downstream applications, the most famous of which is probably Galileo, the European version of the GPS system, where they spend a lot of money on making that happen, and some of that money has to go to legal advice. So that's basically where I come in. So it's not just holidays over here; it's also work for my own company.
Right, and the name of your company is that Black Holes BV? Is that right?
That's right. That's correct.
And what a great name when it was just a few weeks ago that we saw the first actual image of an actual black hole, another truly historic development in our understanding of space. So, and just to give our listeners a bit of more specific, as you mentioned some of the consulting work you've done, you mentioned the European Commission and the work on Galileo, but also you've consulted with the European Space Agency, the UN, the Dutch National Aerospace Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, and also the space organizations in Germany, Brazil, Sweden. And what about the U.S.? What about NASA? Have you done any work for NASA?
Well, in a sense, indirectly. The U.S., of course, works in a different manner. And first of all, the space establishment in the United States is so huge, including NASA, that in most respects they already have their own in-house legal capability, so they're not in need for a consultant. Having said that, interestingly, actually from the academic perspective, University of Nebraska annually hosts a one-day conference in Washington, D.C., which is very much focused on U.S. legal issues, where we meet with people from the regulatory agencies like the FAA and the FCC and staffers from the Hill to discuss the U.S. side of space issues. So in that sense, you could say that it is consultancy-like, although that, of course, is not commercial. It's more like the academic advisory function. But other than that, again, because the U.S. has so much people even in the government and also NASA and the other agencies who are experts on this, that they usually don't need to buy outside expertise. And in these smaller countries, that's totally different. I mean, one of the most fascinating jobs I've done over the last couple of years is work with the United Arab Emirates, which you can imagine is not really a big spacefaring nation. So they really have to start from scratch. And that's, of course, where it is much more likely for a person like me to be hired to help them guide them on the path towards proper implementation of law and stuff like that.
Well, and Frans, I know that you mentioned the University of Leiden, which is where you got your undergraduate degree and also your law training as well. How did you find yourself to Nebraska, to the School of Law there?
Well, actually, they found me, and many people, including in the U.S., at first don't understand why Nebraska. But when I tell them, it makes perfect sense. And the main reason is that in Omaha, there is the headquarters of the U.S. Strategic Command, which is, to cut a long story short, the most important part of the U.S. military dealing with the military space effort. And they have an interest in having a high-level space law program in the state itself. Until 11 years ago, when the program in Nebraska was started, they had to send their JAGs, their majors and lieutenant colonels who needed to do a one-year academic postgraduate program. They needed to send them to McGill, to Canada, to get some space law, because there really was no such program in the U.S. So that's where it came from. And then happily they found me, and as I said, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And I've enjoyed working there ever since.
That's great. Well, we have to, I think, set the scene a little bit here to get into our conversation about space and the law. I was just 6 years old, but I remember it vividly, sitting at the dining room table with my family and watching on a little black and white television Neil Armstrong taking the first steps on the moon in July 1969. And from there, probably in the understanding of most people who aren't, deeply invested in this work, we remember launches of the shuttle, the tragic shuttle launch in 1981 that ended in disaster. Maybe we've read a little about the International Space Station, but I think probably most people don't realize just how much activity there is in space exploration and in space launches. Just this year, China launched and landed an unmanned vessel on the moon. That was back in January. A nonprofit organization out of Israel landed a vehicle on the moon last month, as did India. And later this year, Japan is set to make a launch into space towards the moon as well. And of course, we're hearing all sorts of talk out of Europe and even out of the government in the United States about making plans to send additional launches into space toward the moon. And I think even just the other day, President Trump is talking about a commitment over the next several years to a manned space flight to the moon. So all of a sudden, it seems all of a sudden to me anyway, but I'm sure to you, this has been very much a work in progress. Can you give us a sense, really just a big picture sense of what is happening now, both in terms of what governments are doing and what private industry is doing, and where the main efforts are focused at this point?
Yeah. Well, what you mentioned is, of course, the parts that capture the most of the public attention. I mean, going to the moon, whether you do it by robots or even by man landings, of course, want to capture anyone's imagination. So that's on the headlines. And even though it is spectacular and there's a lot going on, and you already basically made the point yourself, increasingly countries are involved in that, and also some private sector participants, by the way. Of course, the bulk of what goes in space is even less spectacular to the average eye. We're talking about huge investments in satellite communications, in Earth observation, which basically are used on a day-to-day basis, and then that even doesn't include the military as of yet, who, of course, in addition, do a lot of stuff which not everybody knows for obvious reasons. So there is a lot more going on, and if you want to put one big change over time, looking back at the day 50 years ago, it was clearly there were basically only two countries that mattered in space, the then Soviet Union and the United States. And the rest was either piggybagging along or not interested at all. And it also meant that space activities largely were for political, strategic, military purposes, and of course some science. So there was no private sector entity really interested or able, except gradually for satellite communications, which relatively early on proved to be a viable sector for commercial activities, for profit-making activities. And since then, in the 50 years since then, we saw not only big other countries such as China, India, you mentioned them, coming up, but also smaller ones, Vietnam, Algeria, Malaysia. So the number of countries becoming active in space is incredibly growing. I mentioned myself the United Arab Emirates because I was involved in there. And in addition to that, you see now an incredibly broad range of private sector activities. And everybody's heard about Elon Musk and his plans for SpaceX to go to the moon or even to Mars. Everybody's heard about Richard Branson and his plans to fly space tours, and now Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin is also catching up. So in terms of the players, the playing field is incredibly more varied than it used to be. And in terms of the activities, the same applies, which includes more and more downstream activities. I mean, going to the moon had, of course, a lot of prestige and technology and science to it, but it was not something that immediately impacted on a daily basis our lives down on Earth. And that obviously has changed immensely. I mean, I will stop there. I could go on for hours, obviously, but I think those are the most salient points.
Right, and so one thing that we've seen change so dramatically are the number of players, both many different countries, and also private enterprise, whether it's Amazon's Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. And you mentioned a couple of sectors that are the focus. One would be space tourism. Another, which has been going on for quite some time already, is satellite communications. And of course, military, activities, and we're not completely sure what that might involve entirely. But maybe the one that seems most interesting, and perhaps one that implicates all sorts of ways in which the law is going to have something to say about it, is the opportunity for commercial development in space. I read recently that I think it's the European Commission has a plan to not only land on the moon, but to mine lunar ice, and what that might entail. What can you tell us about that? And then I do want to get into where the law comes into play in this as well.
Right. That's an excellent lead-in, because probably the most important aspect of space law is that because of its history, because of its orientation originally on state activities, and because of the fact that the main treaties had been drafted in the 60s and early 70s, this was all focused on states and on non-commercial activities. And now that you have all these commercial actors going on, you increasingly need to make sure that the law is applied in the right manner also to these private activities. And that is essentially what is going on all the time, right? If you look, for example, at the United States, because of the nature of international space law, as a state, it is responsible and even liable for what private actors do in outer space. So if Boeing launches something from Cape Canaveral and it crashes into Mexico, the victims or the Mexican state doesn't need to sue Boeing in a U.S. court. It can go directly to the U.S. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and under treaty law, the United States has to pay for the compensation and cannot say, well, it wasn't a NASA rocket, it was a private enterprise. So this, of course, means that the United States, in turn, has to make sure that Boeing, in my example, only launches if it knows what it's doing, if it's properly insured, etc., etc. So that's where you have the whole question of how are you going to include in a proper manner these private entities into this body of international space law, which wasn't tailored to suit their purposes, and that goes both ways, actually.
Well, let me ask, before we get to how private actors fit in, let me understand a little bit about the international agreements in this area, because we've already seen that an individual state can opt out of an international agreement, and so what really is the value or enforceability of that international agreement? We saw, for instance, a change in administrations in this country, and with the swipe of a pen, the United States withdrawing from an international climate agreement, just to give one example. Or you have bilateral agreements that can come and go depending on an administration, the U.S. pulling out of an agreement with Iran over nuclear developments, to give as an example. So first of all, we have some international understandings, but how solid are those really? Or well, I guess, and also what do they cover in terms of all of the new frontiers that we're talking about here, that haven't been tested, that just haven't had a case or a controversy, as we say, to test them really.
Yeah. Well, those are two great questions, and they're also pretty substantial. So I will start answering the first, and if I forget about the second, don't mind, don't hesitate to remind me of it. But the first question basically goes back to the fact that space law, like any element of international law, is only enforceable up to a certain extent, because the international community of states is very much an imperfect legal order. There is no legislative authority to tell all the states what they need to do. There is no states are sovereign, and which basically means that they have the right to join treaties or to move away from treaties if they feel like it, subject to certain rules. And even while they are subject to certain treaty rules, if they violate them, there is no international police force who could punish offenders. It becomes to a large extent a matter of power politics. Now that's sort of the negative part of it, the fact that the glass is half empty. But in the real world, that doesn't mean that these agreements are violated at will. There's always a political price to be paid for that. If you violate too many agreements, everybody knows that you're an untrustworthy partner, so nobody wants to deal with you anymore, nobody trusts you anymore, which creates isolation. And even though, all countries are equal, some countries are more equal than others, obviously, so the bigger ones can take more of that, political flag without really being hurt than the small ones. Obviously, if a small one would do something that the rest of the world community abhors, boycotts and political punishments can quickly force that country back in line. With the major powers, that's obviously something different. But even in the United States, as the largest power in the world, and by the way, also because obviously it's a state of law and a democracy, you can only go so far in continuously ignoring international obligations. And now coming back to space law, the interesting part is that even the Outer Space Treaty, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is generally seen as the most important, most foundational document of space law, to which the United States is a party, but also the then Soviet Union, now Russia and China and Brazil and Nigeria and all the Europeans, and basically everyone who matters is party to that. The United States is a party to that, and there have been 3 or 4 times over the last couple of decades voices in the U.S. government, or actually it started in parts of the private sector, to say we should get out of the Outer Space Treaty because there are some clauses in there that we find are in the way of pursuing our interests. And each time, for good and sound reasons, the U.S. government has resisted those voices because they realize that if they step out of the treaty, they may gain a little bit of freedom here and there because some rules then would not apply, although even there you have to make a caveat, but that goes a little bit into legal theory, so I won't mention that. But so even suppose that you get rid of some of those obstructions, the signal that this gives to the rest of the world is, okay, if the United States does no longer consider this treaty to be binding, why should we, China, we, Russia, find ourselves bound by it anymore? And the backlash of that, the disintegration of any form of order or predictability in how people behave on space, is considered much worse than the little bit of benefit that you may have from withdrawing from a treaty. So long story short, once a treaty obligation is there, and certainly in the case of the space treaties, there is an inherent underlying value in remaining a party, even though technically you could step out, and even though technically that might, on some minor points, give you a little bit more of a wiggle room or freedom.
Well, and the other factor in terms of these international agreements, or the main one from the late 60s that you mentioned, is, at least as far as we know, and you know so much more on this, so you'll tell me if this makes sense or not, but the ways in which these international obligations are tested in the real world beyond the theory, which is what it seems like we have right now, is one country gaining some kind of advantage that isn't apparent right now. In other words, some space programs might be more developed than others, but we still don't have a viable commercial operation on the moon. But come the day that some country establishes a foothold and actually creates some viable commercial operation, that country may feel that it does have an advantage, and that could lead to, some tension in terms of those international obligations. So, we had. we just haven't tested that yet. We haven't seen. I mean, I'm thinking back to the time when, again, going back to the history to Apollo. The Soviet Union looked like it was, and indeed was, winning the race in space. And in order for Apollo to happen, to fulfill President Kennedy's, lofty, aspirational, speech in 1961, and this really kind of amazed me, actually, is they committed 4.4% of our country's entire budget to NASA. I mean, something that is completely unthinkable today. I mean, I think we're less than 0.1% of our budget goes to NASA currently. So it's conceivable that some country that's making a bigger investment in this, or perhaps a private enterprise, does get so far ahead of where we are that they want to exploit that advantage and get out of whatever international obligations would otherwise be binding on them.
Yeah, exactly. And if the United States would now give the wrong example, that makes it politically even more amenable. And I would even go the other way. I mean, you're absolutely right. And if you look at the present landscape, it is clear that, the United States is both militarily and commercially still number one in the world. There's no question about it. The most important developments in the commercial sector in space are very much focused on the United States. Sure, Europe is doing some great stuff. Japan is doing some great stuff. The Russians, of course, have this great legacy, including a lot of experience and expertise, and the Chinese are catching up. But, to cut a long story short, the United States are still number one. But they should use that lead smartly, and part of that is to make sure that there will be a legal system which survives the potential lack of the U.S. being a leading country. Because one thing, which is rather uncertain is whether 20 years from now the U.S. will still be the leading country. China is moving ahead, with a lot of dedication. They have, in that sense, the advantage of not being a democracy. So unless in the U.S., where each year you have to defend your budget before Congress, and it's very difficult to make long-term plans, and you mentioned it yourself, administrations change. In China, once the top of the pyramid says we're good to go, then for the next 20 years you can follow up on that. That's basically the way things work. So they can create an incredible focus on doing what they want, and they are massively ambitious. And now they still are vulnerable. I don't mean just vulnerable in a military sense, but in a general political sense. They're still trying to catch up. So if you can, entice them to come to certain agreements that will limit the possibility that later on they will be, when they will overtake, they will be the ones who are most to benefit. That is something that should be ingrained in your policy thinking as well. And to come back to the commercial stuff, space mining is a great example. If you talk about space mining right now, everybody focuses on the couple of U.S. companies who've done a great job so far in creating certain starting platforms to go there, although they are also facing investment problems and things like that. But I'm afraid that the first who will actually set foot on the moon will be Chinese. And if we don't have, going back to an earlier point of view, if we don't have a proper regime for regulating commercial exploitation of the moon, before, precisely as you indicate, before actually someone is going to be there, then obviously it will be much more difficult, because once one country or its commercial enterprise, and in China the two are one and the same because there is no private sector in the real sense of the word, obviously, once they have something at stake there, they're not going to give it away just for the sake of some legal nicety. So they won't sign up to a treaty which they don't consider is in their interest. And at this point in time, when the interests are still relatively fluid and everything is moving, that is probably the best moment to create a a new law which can help us for another 20 or 30 years. I'm sorry, it's a long story, but it is very complicated.
No, that's absolutely. And it's so fascinating. And you mentioned this a bit a few minutes ago that I want to pick up on, which is we have something of a basis of law in international obligations, but what you mentioned earlier was that we do lack certain institutions to support that law. If we imagine a blank slate, a brand new country, on Earth, we can imagine what are the institutions that we'd want to establish to create a lawful society, right? We would want courts, we would want a legislature. You mentioned a police force. We would want an executive branch of some kind. But when you're talking about institutions to manage law, to create and enforce and develop law between countries regarding activities in space, I mean, do we have any institutions to support that law, and if not, what institutions do you think we would need to have?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And actually,
I'll have good questions.
Yeah, another great question, absolutely. And the answer is, unfortunately, a typically legal one, is yes and no. We do have one institution which, goes furthest in the direction that you are thinking about, and that's, of course, the United Nations. But that immediately clarifies also the problem, because the United Nations is not a single superstate, and there actually might be good reasons. Not only might there good reasons for that not to be a superstate, there might also be good reasons for not wanting it to be a superstate, because you can fill that in yourself, I guess. But obviously, all the countries in the world see the United Nations as a platform where they can defend their national interests, and only if all these interests converge, the United Nations can actually move ahead. And only when more or less all countries in the world are as a consequence of World War II, are finding genocide atrocious and something that should be fought at all consequences, is it possible to create a convention prohibiting genocide, just to give you one example. So the United Nations comes closest to something like that, but obviously it doesn't get anywhere nearly or really close to a world government, and again, that might be for good reasons. Or to give you a lower level example, in Europe, I'm sure you followed that with some interest as well. In Europe, we have done the effort, at least for the Western European countries, to create something which, and it doesn't just focus on space, obviously, but to come close to a kind of a federation or a super government with one eye to the history of the United States, I should say, and that's, of course, the European Union. But everybody knows how much in the fire the European Union is right now. And again, because many of the individual countries at some point in time don't want to give away their sovereignty to a supranational or international entity, which is the sort of baseline. So while from a certain vantage point, it would be great if we would have a world government, because then we could create a true legal order, and it would be impossible for rogue states to behave as they do. But before you get there, I mean, you and I only want the world government which somehow looks similar to governments in a democratic country, right? And well, if you look at the world today, unfortunately, that is not the likely outcome of the discussions.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's a little hard to imagine. I mean, it's now. It might have been difficult to imagine a generation ago a federated government as to certain issues, particularly economic issues in Europe. Now we see it, and it is possible. Not without some bumps in the road, of course, but to imagine some type of international authority that would include China and Russia and the U.S. and India and many, many small countries too, that's very difficult to imagine.
Absolutely, yeah.
What about, is there any analogy in the handling of mining, so to speak, in international waters? Because it does seem like that's an area where countries have had to deal with one another, whether it's fishing or actual mining at the bottom of the seafloor and things like that. Is there any analogy there that might give us some hope in terms of thinking about space and law?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Because probably the most foundational legal rule applicable to space is that it is not subject to national appropriation. So I usually use the shorthand term global commons for that. And I always, we talked briefly about Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin planting the U.S. flag on the moon. It could obviously not mean that the moon became part of U.S. territory. And that is very much similar to the high seas in a legal sense, because also the high seas, or international waters, are not subject to any individual state's jurisdiction. So obviously when we are developing space law, we often look to the law of the high seas to see whether parallels are helpful. Now, the problem with the law of the sea is, in one sense, that it has been developed already over the ages, and certainly over the last century with a number of important treaties, but not all in the same direction. And let me take one step back. If you get the discussion, if you summarize the current international discussion on space mining, on the mining of celestial bodies, the moon or asteroids and their resources, it goes back to the fact that everybody agrees that space as such is not subject to national appropriation, but what does it mean for the resources? And some people then say, well, look at the ocean floor, where we have the regime of the legal regime for the ocean floor, where we do have an international licensing regime, where a company can only validly, legitimately mine the resources on the ocean floor, the manganese nodules, if they have a license given by an international authority, and otherwise they are not allowed to do so. And a number of countries would like to have a similar regime for space mining based on their interpretation of this global commons nature and referring to their part of the law of the sea. And the opposite side, including notably the United States and countries also like Luxembourg, I should say, in Europe, have taken the opposite approach and said, no, the global commons should compare it to fishing. Just like, the high seas themselves are not subject to any national state's jurisdiction. There's no single state who can say this part of the high seas is mine and everybody else stays out. I'm the only one who can license anyone else to go there. No, that's not the way it works. But at the same time, once you comply with international rules on overfishing and pollution, every validly licensed shipping vessel can go there and go and fish. You mentioned it yourself. And once you have the fish, you can validly sell it and make money with it. And that's the analogy we want to make. So there is still a debate going on in the international arena, although I have a little bit of a feeling that the U.S. position is gradually winning. But it's not all done yet. But the fight is between two different interpretations of this global commons clause, which both use analogies from the law of the high seas, the one referring to the ocean floor and the other to the fishing.
Wait, so the U.S. position on global commerce, let's say if we imagine the U.S. or a U.S. company like Amazon landing on the moon, is the U.S. position that although you can't own the moon or even some sector on the moon, whatever you mine from the surface of the moon is yours? Is that the... Okay.
And that's what they have. I don't know if you're aware, but in 2015 there was this Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act enacted by the previous president, which did a number of things, but it included a specific set of articles addressing space mining, and the first point they made was exactly this, that under U.S. law, it is possible if you have a license, and the licensing regime is actually still being developed, but if you have a license from the United States to go there and to mine the moon, you mentioned Amazon, the two companies which so far have been in the front lights are Planetary Resources and Deep Space Industries, because they were basically the first to hatch these plans, and they pushed for that legislation. The legislation basically said, well, if you go there and you mine that stuff, as long as you comply with the rules of international space law, for us, for the United States, you are the valid owner of that stuff, and you can therefore validly sell it.
Mm. Well, and of course, if you're going to take that view, then you have to accept that China and Russia and India and all the other countries that have the capabilities to get there and plant their flag, even if only for a photo opportunity, but maybe more importantly, to set up some ongoing operation for mining there, that they're going to take and be entitled to keep what they get.
Absolutely.
Can't have it both ways.
And that is exactly the game playing out today, because to give you a little bit more of a perspective, the country which is most vocally opposed against this U.S. approach is Russia. They try to make a stink in the international discussion and say, well, this is, old imperialist United States all over again, cloaked as private enterprise. They simply want to occupy the moon, and they want to become the sole ruler of outer space. It's a bit of a Cold War language going on there, but that's the point the Russians made. Well, the Chinese, you would expect from a geopolitical perspective, to side with the Russians. Anything to put a stick in the wheel of the U.S., politically speaking, and to try to obstruct it, like they did together with the Russians a number of years ago, when they tried to propose a treaty on the de-weaponization of outer space, which was essentially meant to curb the U.S. potential to use space for military purposes. A little bit of a sidestep, but it shows you that it would be politically logical for the Chinese to side with the Russians and also say, oh, this is a false move of the United States, this is illegal, this is inappropriate, this is bad, we should get against that, etc. But on the contrary, they are sitting on the fence, because they know that if the United States gets what it wants, international recognition, widespread international recognition of the possibility to own stuff once you accept it, nobody, certainly not the United States, can then blame the Chinese if they're going to do it on the moon 10 years from now. That's exactly your point.
Well, and now I'm going to hold you to what you said earlier, which is that I could come back to the point about the commercial operations in space, and I want to come into that this way, because one of the things that I was fascinated to read about as I was looking back at the history of Apollo 11 and what was going on back in that time is that, mentioned earlier, the huge investment that our government had to make in order to realize this dream. And a huge investment of dollars at a time when there was also a lot of social unrest in this country, the civil rights movement, and even protests at the launch of Apollo 11 that how are we spending millions and probably in today's dollars billions of dollars on what probably seemed like a vanity to most people at that time, when there is such economic need on the ground here in this country. So and that awareness has only become greater, I think, in the 50 years since, that we have terrible income inequality in this country, for example, that so many people are focused on and worrying about. So to gather the political will to commit the resources that it would take for this country to compete in outer space economic development, do you think that the role of private enterprise, companies like Amazon, that don't have to worry about quite as much how they're spending the billions that they have, or Elon Musk or Branson or Boeing or some of the other big shots in space industry, do you see more that we're going to see more from private enterprise versus efforts sponsored by the U.S. government because of that?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, actually, the whole resistance against spending so much money on space already started in the last years of Apollo. Maybe you were too young, but originally they had planned up to Apollo 20, but the last 3 flights were cancelled because the Congress didn't want to spend any money there, because politically speaking, everybody said, well, we've been there, we've done that, let's spend our money on different things. So that in particular the science community was very much disappointed because at the time, of course, they realized that the first flights were for prestige purposes, and all these astronauts, by the way, were, of course, military guys. There's been only one real scientist at the very last Apollo 17 landing, the last one which landed on the moon. That's the only scientist who was there. All the rest was, fighter jocks who switched to flying spacecraft. And NASA and the scientists thought, okay, now we've done that. We know how to handle the technology and the operational side of it. Now we can start putting people for a number of weeks and not fighter jocks who did a little bit of archaeology class because they had to, but, the real geologists who knew what rocks look like. And that, of course, never came to fruition. And so in that sense, it's absolutely inevitable that the private sector takes over. It hasn't happened for 40 years, which meant that for 40 years, space was largely outside of the view of the general populace. I mean, as we discussed before, there was a lot of interesting stuff going on already, but it was all still government-led, if not entirely government-funded and run. Even the practical applications like satellite remote sensing or satellite navigation were paid for by government, even in the United States, which is, of course, generally seen from a world perspective as the largest private enterprise country you can find.
Well, and even the internet, even the internet in its origins was a product of the government. But now we have
changing. And the key point that everybody starts hammering on is if you really want to make space cheaper and more useful for many applications and make it come within the realm of all countries and also average consumers like you on news services, the price of access to space has to go down. Currently, it is still in the range of $10,000 per pound of weight that you put in outer space. And that is simply not a long-term viable proposition for the private sector because there are only very few applications that make it worth that while. And for the government, because you still have to convince the electorate that you need to spend all that money. Having said that, of course, we are talking about governments who have an electorate, right? If we talk about authoritarian states or dictatorships, think about the way China and Russia are run right now, they don't have these problems. But if the Western world, if the free world is going to be able to continue to compete, the private sector plays an incredible role, and part of that is in trying to get the launch costs down. So if SpaceX succeeds in reusing on a continuous basis its launch vehicles, and they've done a very successful test just a few weeks ago, that could mean a revolution. And if you bring it down from $10,000 per pound to already $1,000 per pound, a factor of 10, that already makes it so much more possible for also smaller private companies to benefit from space. That is the development that I see around the corner.
Mm. Well, and it's
plays a very, very fundamental role in that context. In order to make sure that the bona fide private companies, get their legitimate chances to make some money, while you keep the cowboys out, because there's always a risk that you have, people who don't really know what they're doing or who couldn't care less if they create problems for others. Who make a big mess, either in terms of space debris or they blow up an asteroid without knowing what they're doing or whatever. And of course, we should create a balance there, and the law is a crucial tool to help establish that balance.
Well, and again, it's not any longer about a race to land someone on the moon. It's no longer about vanity. It's not even any longer about pure science. It's about commerce and competition for resources, which, I mean, there is a limit to what resources are available, on Earth, and to the extent there are vast resources available on asteroids, on the moon, and who knows where else. It just seems inevitable that both governments and private industry, and maybe in the case of China, some combination of of government and private industry in a way we couldn't really replicate in this country, it is going to go there. And the law is either going to, as you said, lead or is going to come kicking and screaming following behind all of this. And I guess that's the great question we probably don't know the answer to.
Absolutely. We're doing our best, but there's only so much we can do, of course.
Right. Well, I want to thank you so much. I've been really looking forward to this. And as I mentioned, I was just a little boy when Apollo 11 landed, and I'm sure like many young boys and girls who watched that, it just touched off a fascination with outer space. And I mean, you've devoted your life's work to it, and so I want to thank you so much. Professor Frans van der Dunk, a professor of space law at Nebraska College of Law, being on the phone with us from his home in the Netherlands to talk with us about this as we approach the 50th anniversary of the Apollo landing on the moon, and more importantly, all these incredible and really challenging developments in space as we look ahead and as we look up.